provincial governments to establish robust and well-funded Indigenous civilian police oversight bodies or branches within established reputable civilian oversight bodies within the jurisdiction, which must include representation of Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited people, inclusive of diverse Indigenous cultural backgrounds. And then it lays out further steps under that head. It's important. The reality is Indigenous people in Canada, whether they're on sort of as the accused within the criminal justice process or a victim, are feeling the wide effects of racism and systemic racism that have been occurring for a long time. We are seeing a trend towards civilianization of services. We can look to other jurisdictions to see where things work well, like the Philadelphia model, or in cases of missing persons, where a large membership of the force are civilian, but they assist on the things that don't require the investigative techniques and tactics that the police officers are using. If we do not start to make change, we are only going to see a worse and increasing statistical reality of over-incarceration and over-victimization. During the course of the national inquiry, and it started in 2016, and the final report came out in June 3rd, 2019, not only did we not see a slowing down of the violence that was occurring for Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited, transgendered, and gender fluid people, it actually was increasing. So during the course of time, when the hearing was going across the country and listening to not only families or victims, but also to experts and to institutions, there was an additional 130 cases that were unresolved where there was violence that caused the death of an Indigenous woman. And although the reports vary, we saw between 140 to 158 Indigenous women in that same time period disappeared or going missing without an unresolved case. So in that 3-year time period, an additional 158 women, Indigenous women, went missing while the national inquiry was trying to look at the systemic causes that create that world of violence for Indigenous women. There's no shortcuts, there's no short answers. If we don't engage and start to change our practices and fundamentally change, have a paradigm change in how we police Indigenous communities or support Indigenous communities in policing, we will continue to see these dire statistics. I am really looking forward to today's conversation and dialogue. Chibi Gwech.
Thank you very much, Christa. Knia, I'll pass the floor to you now.
Thank you. Nyawa, Sego, Ani, Knia Singh, Indigenous cause. And I say that in honor of Christa and all Indigenous people that have lived on this land for thousands of generations. And I say that because we as Canadians who are here on this land sharing with them, we must also recognize how to greet. As we recognize French and English, we should be greeting in the Indigenous languages to begin with. So again, Nyawa. I've been part of police reform for quite some time. I've started out my career as a music producer who was privy to a lot of insights in neighborhoods, assisted a lot of communities, and hence my political aspirations to make a difference. But also what came along with it is a very early recognition at a young age that I was subject to differential treatment based upon my color, my race, my skin tone. And what started out as naivety, as because I understand, and I'll start off by saying policing is a very necessary component of our society. It's necessary to maintain balance and order. However, when that balance and order isn't rooted in fairness or justice or truth, then it becomes a lopsided affair, which I would say we've seen throughout the existence of policing in North America. And seeing the results on me, believing as a young child, once I wanted to be a police officer, but also believing that everyone is treated fairly and police officers will come to the rescue and protect you, understanding as I grew older that that wasn't the case for someone like me, that unfortunately the opposite was very true. It changed my perspective on what was my priority. As I said, I ran a music studio and had a lot of interaction with young people. So I was privy to a lot of information firsthand from them, where I would intervene in situations, attend court hearings, and try to assist. It got to a point where, as an older person, a mature person, I realized one of my first lines of defense is knowing the law and having the law on my side, so that when my rights were violated, that I could protect myself. This was something that led to where you see now. The work that my firm does is very much related to social justice. Ma'at means truth, justice, balance, and order in Kemetic, which is ancient Egyptian. And it's something that our country says it prides itself on. Our police forces say they pride themselves on integrity, honor, and justice. However, we see far too often when it comes to other communities, specifically African descendant and indigenous, that fair justice and honesty does not take the same course. I'll start off by just touching on some systemic roots of racism in policing and its origins. Not sure if it's well known that policing actually is a derivative of slave patrols in the United States and across North America, whereby bands of men were sent out to look for slaves that have run away. And when I say slaves, I mean actual human beings, African people who were captured and held in bondage. For them, these bands went around and then they gathered people up and took them back. It became a militia group, and then it became an oversight body. I'm not saying that what our police forces are now are anywhere near what the origin of policing is. But if we understand the original elements, we can now understand why we are here and how to fix it. And one of the major issues when it comes to policing, in my experience, that I've seen is that the systemic racism in policing comes out of a lot of misinformation, and it comes out of fear. And what also statistically we find is police members usually don't police in their own community. Toronto Police, for example, it was at one time made up out of a lot of people who come from the outstanding outlying areas, such as York region, Durham region, Peel region, etc. When you don't understand the community you're policing, you tend to not have empathy for them. And then when you break it down to race, unfortunately, the empathy afforded to Indigenous and African descendant people is not the same as it is afforded to the same Caucasian people who generally make up the majority of policing. And this is a natural phenomenon amongst all races. This is not to say that one race prefers themselves over the other. But when you have the opportunity and the privilege and the honor of serving and protecting all human beings in your jurisdiction, that should not be changed by who looks like you, who's from your family, or whose religion you don't like. And this is the main objective of organizations such as this before us, the Commission of Jurists, and people like Big Canoe and Mr. Gurmukh and myself and others. I just want to make sure that I'm setting a context for why we are where we are, so that when we discuss later on, we can really get to where we need to be. So the patterns of behavior are formulated from misinformation, racial biases, stories told from elders passed down to their children. You know, those people are no good. You've heard many times the no good Indian, or the, unproductive Black person used in other expletives. These things are passed down to generations, to communities, and when they take positions of power, unfortunately, those conscious and subconscious biases are carried along with them. There have been many historical attempts to correct this behavior. You can look at Martin Luther King, you can look at Malcolm X, and no one is to say either way was wrong, because one is about, trying to work with people and accept, and then the other is about self-preservation and making sure that you are protected. Police officers and policing is very set on making sure that each officer comes home, and all of their weapons and their armor and their ability to arrest and detain comes from protection of oneself, of themselves, and the others around them. And there's no reason why communities such as Indigenous communities and African descendant communities should not be able to protect themselves. And how we do this is through legal action and advocacy and other means. But unfortunately, there is not a lot of financial resources in both of our communities, nor is there the desire to put yourself on the line. And why I say that, what happened to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? For speaking out against racial injustice, they were killed. Any of the other organizations that have risen in the past usually get subdued or put down. For example, in Ontario, you had Dudley Laws and Charles Roach, who formed the Black Action Defense Committee. And we have the Special Investigations Unit right now because of them. If it wasn't for the disproportionate killings of Black men in Toronto by Toronto police in the late 70s and early 80s and throughout the 80s and 90s, we would not have this Special Investigations Unit because police were investigating themselves. The corruption ran all the way from the person pulling the trigger to the person making the decision on whether they were responsible or not. And the problem with no accountability is when you don't have accountability, it becomes a free-for-all for misconduct behavior, and the communities affected lose an ability to feel like they have any recourse. And it's so important that events like this take place, because these conversations have progressed over the years where a person like me can sit here before you and say these things through experience and through legal knowledge. One example of the Special Investigations Unit is the fact that so many of the cases that are put before them are cleared. A Human Rights Commission report in 2018 demonstrated that Blacks are 20 times more likely to be shot or killed or hurt by police in these type of encounters. And that is just not acceptable statistics when people of African descent only make up a certain percentage, which is about 6% of the area that they're in. Before I just pass it off, I would just mention that there are many cases that my firm has worked on that which speak to these issues, such as a man who was 40 years old, no criminal record, and his house raided, him assaulted, him losing his job and being charged with an offense when he was totally innocent. A correctional officer being attacked by 2 white officers after the George Floyd incident. Another police officer in the north region of just north of Toronto, who was recruited by a police force, and then because he wrote a senior officer's son a ticket and didn't know that, he was then targeted for dismissal and eventually had to resign. So these are just small examples, because racism in policing is not only from the police to the community, but it's also internal within policing towards other officers. So I understand that, and we're going to have a longer discussion on this, so I will conclude my statements here and look forward to our conversation later.
Thank you very much, Knia. Sunil, over to you.
Thank you, Julianne, the ICJ, and the University of Ottawa for having me. My brother Neil is a U Ottawa Law alum, and he's a tax partner at a large firm in Toronto. I always like to say, I steal from the rich and give to the poor, and he steals from the poor and gives to the rich. So together we provide absolutely no benefit to society. Our parents couldn't be prouder. It's a privilege to share this virtual stage with my fellow panelists, whom I've admired for quite some time. Last summer, outside our windows, we saw thousands protesting against anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in policing. They were protesting the deaths of Jamal Francique, DeAndre Campbell, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, and Rodney Levy, Black and Indigenous people who died last year following contact with police in Canada. You've heard this already from Christa and Knia. Anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in policing in Canada is systemic. It's a day-to-day reality for Black and Indigenous people, and the effects are devastating. I've learned from listening to the lived experiences of Black people. When I was at the African Canadian Legal Clinic, my first client was a Black man who was driving home from work. He was taken down at gunpoint by the police in his own driveway. 2 of my other first clients were a Black mother and her son. He was tasered twice while handcuffed outside of a plaza next to his high school. There are many Canadian court and tribunal decisions, studies, and reports that demonstrate that systemic racial discrimination in policing is a reality. 2 of those reports are from the Ontario Human Rights Commission's inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination of Black people by the Toronto Police Service. We released a collective impact, our first interim report, in December 2018, and a disparate impact, our second interim report, last summer. We expect to release our final report in the fall. as indicated by the interim Chief Commissioner, Ina Chada, at the launch of a disparate impact. The goal of the inquiry was, and still is, to build trust between the Toronto Police and Black communities, to empirically study the issues to pinpoint the problem areas, and to make strong recommendations to address the roots of the problems. The Commission retained Dr. Scott Wortley, a professor at U of T's Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies, to analyze data obtained by the Commission to assist with it and to assist with the inquiry. I want to go through some of the numbers. The Special Investigations Unit data analyzed by Dr. Wortley is disturbing. The Commission found that between 2013 and 2017, a Black person was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police, a significant racial disparity that has persisted since the early 2000s. When Toronto police officers shoot Black people, they are more likely to die. From 2000 to 2006, 7 of 13 Black shooting victims died from their injuries, compared to only 1 of 9 white shooting victims. From 2013 to 2017, 7 of 9 Black shooting victims died from their injuries, compared to only 2 of 10 white shooting victims. We also compiled and analyzed data about Toronto Police lower level use of force that does not result in serious injury or death. In other words, Toronto Police use of force that does not trigger the SIU's mandate, but is still damaging physically from cuts and bruises, but also mentally. Black people represent about 8.8% of Toronto's population, but almost 40% of lower level use of force incidents from 2016 and 2017. Dr. Wortley's analysis of charge and arrest data from the Toronto Police also confirmed what Black people have known for decades, that they bear a disproportionate burden of law enforcement. We examined 9 discretionary lower level charges from 2013 to 2017, including simple drug possession, obstructing a police officer, and out-of-sight driving offenses like driving without insurance. Black people represent 8.8% of Toronto's population, but almost a third of all of those charges. White people were underrepresented. Black people and white people use cannabis at roughly the same rate, but Black people represented almost 40% of people involved in cannabis charges. Only 20% of the charges examined by the Commission, regardless of race, resulted in conviction. However, charges against Black people were more likely to be withdrawn and less likely to result in a conviction than those involving white people. The Commission called on the Toronto Police Service, Toronto Police Services Board, and the City of Toronto to formally establish a process with Black communities, Black organizations, and the Commission to adopt and implement legally binding remedies that will result in fundamental change. In other words, remedies that are legally enforceable. Black community and advocacy groups such as the Black Legal Action Center, the Association of Black Law Enforcers, and the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers have made statements supporting the OHRC's call for legally binding remedies. That same approach, that approach of legally binding remedies, underlies the Commission's project with Peel Police. In October last year, the Commission, the Peel Regional Police, and its board signed a memorandum of understanding committing to develop and implement legally binding remedies to identify and eliminate systemic racism in policing, promote transparency and accountability, and enhance Black, other racialized, and Indigenous communities' trust in policing throughout Peel. Outside of the Commission, I'm also working on exposing racial profiling through a partnership with Western University's Faculty of Law. I'm leading the Hidden Racial Profiling Project. I have 2 goals. Number 1, to make invisible racial profiling visible and get the attention it deserves. And number 2, to provide an applied research opportunity to law students interested in racial justice. We are currently identifying cases involving major municipal police forces across Canada and rights violations like arbitrary detentions, unreasonable searches, and excessive force. We will contact Defense Counsel and victims to determine the race of the victims in these cases. And I expect that we'll uncover many cases that involve Black or Indigenous victims that are consistent with racial profiling. And we will make those cases visible. A clear example is the Queen and Bonds, a 2010 decision from the Ontario Court of Justice. The Ontario Court of Justice concluded that Ottawa police officers violated the rights of Stacey Bonds. She was arrested for public intoxication in 2008, but the arrest was unlawful. She was not publicly intoxicated or a threat to herself or anyone else. She was taken to a holding cell at the police station and was strip searched by multiple officers, including a male officer who used scissors to cut off her bra. She was left half naked in the cell for over 3 hours and soiled her pants. The decision makes no mention of the fact that Ms. Bonds is Black or the issue of racial profiling. However, it's clearly consistent with racial profiling. In the words of the late Congressman John Lewis, I hope the Hidden Racial Profiling Project will make some good trouble. There are things that police services and the government of Ontario should do to address systemic racism in policing, including data collection and Crown screening of charges, which I'd be happy to talk about later on this panel. But there are things that we can all do to address systemic racism in policing as members of our communities, as students, lawyers, parents, or colleagues. It doesn't need to be your day job. Together, we must stand up to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in policing. Racial justice depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Chief Sloly, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I too will acknowledge and very much appreciate that I'm speaking here today from the traditional lands and unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. My name is Peter Sloly and I'm the Chief of the Ottawa Police Service. I'm proud to serve the 1 million souls who reside in the nation's capital. I'm proud of my three successful and very different careers where I've had the opportunity to represent Canada and its interests locally, nationally, and internationally. I am proud of over 3 decades as a police officer working to advance the profession of policing and safety in the country. I'm a proud Black man, a proud native of Jamaica, and a proud Canadian citizen. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity to participate in this discussion on systemic racism in policing in Canada. This discussion is important and necessary. I will start by unequivocally stating that Canada is the best country in the world, that the Canadian police model is the best in the world, and that Canadian police officers are among the finest people in the world. I will also unequivocally state that individual and systemic racism exists in Canadian policing, in all Canadian institutions, and in Canadian society. These statements are not mutually exclusive. The ongoing negative impact of systemic racism is eroding the public's trust and confidence in policing, a profession that is essential to keeping our community safe. Not addressing systemic racism is not only failing our communities and their need for safety, it also puts our own Canadian police officers themselves at risk. Systemic racism is a well-established concept rooted in our colonial past, embedded in our legislation, enabled in our institutional practices, and sustained in our organizational culture. A common misconception about systemic racism is that it involves a few bad apples who engage in racist thoughts, statements, and/or behaviors. This is not true. Imperfectly good people, like you and like me, can commit acts of omission that allow individual racists to survive and even thrive in organizations. Imperfectly good people can also consciously or unconsciously enable systems to create and perpetuate policies and practices that work to the advantage of some groups and to the disadvantage of others. As I said, systemic racism exists in Canadian society and within all Canadian institutions. I will speak specifically to systemic racism in policing. To dismantle systemic racism in policing, along with all other forms of discrimination, we need to make positive investments in police culture, police operations, and broader institutional ecosystem changes that allow the police to operate more effectively. Let me speak first to police culture. Changing police culture or any organization's culture is not something that can happen overnight. However, there are some specific steps that police leaders can do today to build a healthier police culture for tomorrow. For example, a greater critical mass of diverse sworn and civilian personnel at every level of the police service has shown to diminish some of the more pernicious aspects of police culture. I'm grateful to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, whose experts identified the following 3 areas that can also be implemented, and where implemented, are effective in changing culture and eliminating systemic racism. First, collecting and analyzing disaggregated race-based and demographic-based data to more accurately assess and address systemic issues. Second, developing a full equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy, along with applying the adequate resources and leadership to effectively implement that strategy. And third, identifying and removing all aspects of the organization's culture that sustain systemic racism and/or resists attempts to dismantle it. The Ontario Human Rights Code and the new Comprehensive Police Services Act of Ontario establish the responsibilities for police services, police boards, and police oversight bodies to prevent and address both individual and systemic racism. There is a further positive obligation on police services to make sure that they are not engaging in systemic discrimination of any form. All Ontario police services must comply with these legislative requirements and standards. That said, Canadian police leaders, like myself, must go well beyond mere legal compliance. We must demonstrate our own personal and professional commitment to promoting and protecting human rights and charter rights. We must take the initiative to lead the redevelopment of all of our core systems, human resources, information technology, finance, and operations, such that those systems accelerate the advancements that we have made to bring greater levels of diversity, equity, and inclusion into policing, while also further dismantling systemic racism that has too long persisted in policing. The next area is policing operations. The community do not want law enforcement or use of force to be the dominant problem-solving tools of police, nor do they want law enforcement to be a dominant factor that shapes police culture. These concerns help to explain why Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities feel that they are over-policed, underserved, and overrepresented in the criminal justice system. The community and police do not want to be the only or even primary response option to every type of call for service everywhere in the country on a 24/7, 365 basis. This model does not fully serve the community's needs, and it puts police officers in the untenable position where they do not and cannot have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to consistently and successfully deal with non-police related calls, most notably calls with people involving people suffering from mental health and/or addictions. The public and police members want policing that prevents and reduces crime. They also want police to partner more effectively with community to address a wider variety of public safety issues, neighborhood disputes, parking complaints, road safety, school safety, disorderly behavior in public spaces, as well as other human services issues where the police play a support role, but not necessarily a lead role. Simply put, the police should prevent first and foremost, enforce last and least, while partnering in all ways and always. That is why the Ottawa Police Service is committed to making major investments in the following 3 operational strategies. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the new Police Service Act requires every municipality in Ontario to create and implement community safety and well-being plans, which focus on crime prevention through addressing the social determinants of health. I understand that British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and even Quebec are considering a similar change in their Police Services Act. This can be a national strategy, not just an Ontario provincial strategy. These community safety and well-being plans require the municipality to convene the police, education, healthcare, social services, along with community stakeholders from the not-for-profit sector to create, implement, and evaluate a proper service delivery model that proactively assesses and addresses community risks such as poverty, homelessness, food scarcity, mental health, addictions, systemic racism, system navigation, all of which are the underpinnings of the majority of crimes committed in Canada. The goal is to address these criminogenic factors in the pre-justice space, not in the justice system itself. The best way to prevent crime is by addressing the root causes of crime in full partnership with the community, using an integrated service delivery model. We can do this while still demonstrating the ability to deal with the most prolific criminal offenders through investigation, prosecution, incarceration, and where appropriate, rehabilitation. The next operating change for police specifically is to adopt a neighborhood policing model. I believe this is the best model where police operations can properly integrate with those other system and service providers. Neighborhood policing, where you assign police service members who can be both sworn officers and civilian members into more marginalized, underserved, and undersupported neighborhoods, which are usually our most racialized neighborhoods, where they develop long-term relationships and partnerships with those other institutional and local service providers to prevent and address those aforementioned community safety and well-being issues. The third area of operations involves the full spectrum of the justice system. We need more off-ramps for people who are entering into the justice system and better restorative and rehabilitative processes to reduce recidivism. Even when the police do make arrests and lay charges, the police must do everything possible to create off-ramps out of the justice system, primarily through pre- and post-charge diversion. Even upon conviction, there must be a full effort by the justice system to use Aboriginal and Indigenous restorative practices, along with evidence-based best practices, to improve rehabilitation and reduce recidivism. The third area is around the integration of our institutions within the ecosystem. Canadian institutions are interdependent, interactive, and compounding on each other. For example, individual and systemic racism in education, healthcare, social services, and public housing will directly and have directly contributed to the underpinning elements of crime. Criminal activity will eventually engage the justice system and policing into this cascading set of institutional failures. We can no longer afford to operate the primary human services institutions separately. They must be part of a virtual continuum. The current siloed, balkanized approach to the human services institutions results in dangerous gaps and wasteful overlaps. Institutional integration includes joint problem assessment, data sharing, resource sharing, all to accomplish the creation, implementation, and evaluation of joint solutions and shared outcomes. This integrated service delivery model will enable the co-production of public safety at a higher level and the quicker co-destruction of systemic racism. This all requires significant reform at all three levels of government, in all of the human services institutions, and across the full spectrum of the justice system, from cops to courts to corrections. It requires stronger partnerships between the justice system elements and the not-for-profit sector. I believe this is the area where we can make the biggest and most impactful and most needed changes to address systemic racism in policing and all aspects of Canadian society. Changes that will save the lives of community members and police service members. Changes that will provide greater dignity and respect to minority community members and to police service members. Changes that will rebuild public trust and police morale. Changes that will result in a massive return on investment for taxpayers and a massive opportunity for further investments in community and safety well-being for all Canadians in all communities. I come to my conclusion. I'm proud of the progress that has been made in my chosen profession of policing. I'm proud of the members of the Ottawa Police Service for their contributions to that progress. I'm proud of all members of Canada's police services who have contributed to advancing our social fabric, our democracy, and our nation. Much has been accomplished, but much more needs to be done. I'm personally and professionally committed to fixing this issue. Thankfully, I'm not alone in this work. I'm surrounded by a critical mass of other leaders in the Ottawa Police Service and across this great country. Police leaders who know that this is not the time for resisting change. This is not the time for incremental change. This is the time to make real change. Policing in Canada has been moving from denial and resistance to listening, dialoguing, learning, owning, partnering, co-designing, and co-producing the cultural, operational, and ecosystem-wide changes we need to dismantle systemic racism in policing and in Canadian society. The conditions to make meaningful change exist right here and right now in Canada. There are no more excuses. Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities need this. Women and newcomers need this. Frontline police officers and police chiefs need this. All Canadians need this, and we need it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Sloly. I'll pass it over to Akwasi now. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well, panelists and Chief Sloly. I've been on panels enough and worked enough with Chief Sloly to know that I shouldn't have volunteered to follow him in the lineup, but here I am anyway. My hopes is that at least a few people are chuckling. I'm a criminologist by trade. I study issues specifically relating to race and policing. And I think part of what Chief Sloly just touched upon with respect to the need for connection between social systems, and I would argue at the same time a detasking of the police, is key to addressing issues related to racial inequality within policing. We need to think about the police as one part of an ecosystem of social systems, one which my hopes is we would call upon less and front end our allocation of resources to give the police less work. Part of what I had planned on doing is giving a bit of a run through of some of the findings related to my own research and academic research in the area of racial inequality in policing. I'm not going to go over all of those because I think both a number of the panelists have done that already, but there are a couple of key areas that I think were not addressed that need to be. I teach a class on inequality and criminal justice at the University of Toronto. And one of the things that I ensure that my students leave that class acknowledging is that the police and other segments of our criminal justice system do not just respond to various forms of social inequality, but they also serve to create it. And so I think we need to think very seriously about the ways in which policing and discriminatory policing actually creates inequality through the hypercriminalization, for example, of young Black men. And so some areas not yet addressed that I think need to be taken into consideration is not only simply acknowledging that there are disparate rates of police stop and search, for example, that Black and Indigenous people are exposed to, but also the nature of their contacts during those encounters. So the phenomenon or the concept of procedural justice is extremely important. Procedural justice simply relates to the treatment that civilians receive at the hands of the police and other justice agencies during their encounters. We know that that procedural justice, which is afforded through, for example, being civil, being respectful of the civilian, providing that individual with an opportunity to tell their side of the story, and providing an explanation of decision-making goes a long way in influencing not only that individual's perception of that specific encounter, but also the police as an institution itself, the justice system as a broader institution, and our society. Procedurally unjust treatment has a negative impact on the legitimacy of the police and has been shown to increase the likelihood, interestingly enough, that people will engage in offending behavior. So we know that discriminatory police stop and search practices and the experience of police stops increase the likelihood of offending amongst certain groups. We know that the nature of those contacts does the same. And so in thinking of the ways that we address issues of inequality in policing, we need to think about simply the nature of contacts that people, especially marginalized people, have with the police. There are a couple of areas with respect to reform that I think need to be discussed and highlighted, and hopefully we will talk about these a little more as we progress through this afternoon. One, of course, is around the collection of race-based policing data, and this is something that is coming in different ways across the country. When I talk about the collection of race-based data, really I'm talking about the more systematized collection, analysis, and reporting of information about members of the public that the police come into contact to that is disaggregated by race. At the moment, race-based data is not consistently collected within policing. We know that it's collected in certain aspects or for certain policing outcomes because, you know, many of us will have been exposed to, for example, the carding data. We might have seen, for example, some of the arrest data that Sunil talked about a little earlier. But we do not have consistently, systematically collected race-based data, which means it is challenging to identify the key areas that racial disparities exist, and importantly, without information, similar information from other social sectors, to determine the extent to which those disparities are caused by discrimination in policing specifically, or disparities in other areas of our society that might lead to elevated levels of offending, which could be addressed by looking at upstream factors. So Canada needs a robust and well-resourced system for collecting race-based data. The Canadian Associations of Chiefs of Police, in conjunction with Statistics Canada, announced a plan last summer to begin collecting some race-based data on arrests in Canada, which is a good start, but we need information that go well beyond arrests. For example, the report that Sunil referred to documented the rates at which the racial differences not only in arrests for Black versus white people in Toronto, for example, but also racial differences in the likelihood of the charges resulting from those arrests being dropped. And so we need information right from point of first contact, from the stop, through the arrest and into the post-arrest decision-making. We've seen from other jurisdictions, Durham, for example, racial differences with respect to who is versus not provided with diversion or extrajudicial measures in the context of young people. So in order for us to ensure or work toward the provision of equitable policing across this country, especially with respect to race, we need adequate race-based justice policing data. The second point I want to make is simply on the accountability piece. We have a situation still in this country, although we have great oversight mechanisms in certain jurisdictions, where police are still too often not being held to account for their misbehavior. Judges are increasingly acknowledging when police are lying in court, but we still have a situation in which the police culture is still one that is quite protectionist, where officers are still, although things have changed, are still reluctant to report on their peers and their peers' misbehavior. And so we need to continue to strengthen our attempts to modernize, and I don't use the term reform, but to prompt change within the police culture itself so that officers are holding one another accountable. We need to ensure that our police leaders and our police supervisors are holding those underneath their watch accountable, and we need to ensure that our oversight agencies are sufficiently resourced in order to be able to hold the police accountable as part of their mandates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akwasi. So we're going to begin now our discussion. So we'll ask all the panelists to unmute themselves, and we'll have a more of a free-flowing discussion. Just before we start off, I would just remind everybody that we do have a Q&A function. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so. And in about a half an hour's time, we will be going to questions from the audience. So don't forget to ask your question if you have one. So who would like to start off the discussion this afternoon?
If I may be so bold to try to start off, I know I had the first word, but a lot has been said and there's been a lot of great ideas and suggestions put out. There's a couple things. I know Knia spoke about the history of policing to situate where we've come from, where we are, and where we need to move to. And for me, it's really important to remind everyone that Canada does have a distinct history of policing that was perpetuated by the need to clear lands of Indigenous people in order to continue colonization. And there is a report that is very helpful for understanding that context. The Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba, which is well over 30 years old now, devotes an entire chapter to the coming of police. So the British model brought to Canada for the purpose of clearing the lands and to capturing and isolating Indigenous people. So that's the reason I've raised that point is when we talk about how do we get to where we want to go, it's a lot about relationship building. And part of that is acknowledging the true history of policing in Canada and its original intent, and how law, not just the policing, but also parts of the criminal code, the Indian Act, how those are still barriers to achieving change, right? Where we still have enforcement. So for example, in the Indian Act, we still have provisions on a couple things that are very, quite frankly, damning. So we have a provision on mentally incompetent Indians that has been used both to engage law enforcement to take people and do things. And, you know, you think that's a historical issue, Christa. What are you talking about? During the national inquiry, there was a finding in relation to birth alerts and something that was happening in Saskatchewan up till a couple years ago, where medical practices were actually in place that were sterilizing Indigenous women. We're in, 2020. That was happening in 2017 in this country. So the failure to recognize the path and to change the relationship means we have to look hard at what existed, what continues to exist, and how we move forward. And so one of the other quick points I wanted to make, and maybe it will help start the conversation, during the national inquiry, there was a full week of police policies and practices as part of institutional and expert hearings. There is a list of exhibits that exist in the report, but you can actually access the exhibits online both in written transcript form or in video, that contain, 140 exhibits, including by police institutions from RCMP through municipal police through provincial police, that speak to a number of the live issues. And it's important to recognize that it's not just about a final report, but that this is a warehouse of information that police services, academics, and people can go to hear about the exact issues. In this time frame we have today, we're not even going to be able to scratch the surface on the issues. And when you have a week like this where you go through missing persons investigations, communications with families of missing, the criminalization of Indigenous people, in a full week with that many experts, we did not scratch the surface. And it can seem almost unattainable, but there have been changes. So part of that moving forward has to look at it. And I was very encouraged to hear Chief Sloly talk about the movement between the tasking of what police do to more civilianization of certain tasks. I mean, ALS has been a proponent, so Aboriginal Legal Services, for a number of years has fallen on the side of defunding police services, because we recognize the best solutions lay within the Indigenous community for the issues they're having with police, because they're root and systemic. And so I wanted to just make a further comment to Knia's, that when we talk about Canada, the distinct policing history will always impact the way Indigenous people see police. If we fail to know that history, acknowledge the harm it's caused, we don't move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Miigwech, Christa. I'm glad you you pointed that out, because the policing from an African Canadian perspective, we always directly link a lot of things to slavery. But growing up, I had a very limited knowledge that the RCMP were responsible for a lot of issues. And so when you bring up the police were clearing, are you referring to the RCMP clearing the lands particularly? Sorry, I don't know if Christa heard. Did you hear
Sorry,
me?
I turned a phone went off. I thought it was on. So I put it on.
I was just asking, is it the RCMP that's the police agency you're historically referring to, or is it a different agency?
Historically, it was the Northwest Mounted Police, but then it then combined with other police services to be that. But the Indian Act itself, so I talked about mentally incompetent Indians. The Indian Act itself also empowered police services, mostly RCMP, but police services, to remove children from their homes. The entire residential school legacy in this country utilized police services to remove children from their homes and to put them into the 60s scoop. And it's been the arm of enforcement that's taken away every human basic right Indigenous people in this country have experienced. And some of those provisions still exist and have never been removed out of the Indian Act, although they're not enforced.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that, it draws my recollection that in a lot of police encounters on arrest, police are calling CAS on young families, Indigenous and African descent, and both of our communities have the hugest disproportionate taking of children from their homes. So not only does racism in policing affect the direct policing of people, it also can turn around to family supports and educational supports, because again, as we know, with police officers in schools, there was a huge movement where some students will feel safe, but Indigenous and Black students would be sometimes targeted by school resource officers, and small incidents turn into a police report, turns into a charge. And I've dealt with actually many young, youthful people charged when they've been charged as students over something minor because a police resource officer utilized their power in that way. So it really speaks to the discretion. Racism in policing, or systemic racism in policing, has almost everything to do with discretion, because each time an officer is right in front of that person, they have a choice whether they're going to treat that person with respect or they're going to use every aspect of the law to enforce it upon them. And I'll tell you even a simple anecdote from yesterday. As I'm driving home to the territory that I live on, Tyndonega, I got a call from a client who was in Windsor, and the Windsor police had stopped them because one of his friends had a beer can outside the car, whereas there was a parking lot full of white teenagers or young people doing the same thing, but they were the only 3 Black guys in the entire parking lot. And the police came directly for them, said, "Oh, you guys are from Toronto. What are you doing?" When I finally got on the phone with them, first of all, the police officer, a female officer, did not even believe I was a lawyer. And then she says, "Tell me your client's name." I said, "I'm not going to tell you that." Then what she ended up doing is basically telling my client she has a right to search the vehicle because they saw a beer can. And when I said to her, "You can do a cursory search for bottles, But if you're doing an intrusive search, that's beyond your jurisdiction or beyond the charter. And then she says, well, we're not in court now. And this morning, it just dawned on me. She was basically saying she may know she's doing something illegal, but because we're not in a courtroom, she, as a police officer, is going to use whatever ability she has to complicate the lives of these three young men right there and then, knowing very well that it may end up getting thrown out, but whatever they think they may find or what they're going to do at that time is justifying in her mind what she's doing. And that's an abuse of police authority.
I'd
Thank
love
you,
to
Knia.
jump in.
Oh, sorry, I think I saw Chief Sloly wanted to comment.
Thank you, Julianne. I'm not sure if we should be just active or using the raise hand function, so, but I appreciate that. And I'll yield the floor if there was a further comment to what we're just talking about. I may take us in a different direction. I don't know who was trying to speak.
Oh, I wanted to pick up on some of what was said. So I just want to, there's a few things. I just want to thank Christa and Knia for acknowledging the historical legacy of systemic racism in policing against Black and Indigenous people. And I wanted to thank you, Chief Sloly, for acknowledging that there's systemic racism in policing. And I know you did so in the past and were the target of a hateful video. And that just speaks to how difficult culture change is. You know, we've talked about race-based data collection. What I wanted to do is link race-based data collection to accountability. Because of course, the data is only as good as what you do with it, right? So of course, you know, race-based data collection, there are many benefits. It's been shown to lead to reductions in stops, shootings, and racial disparities. There are improved relationships with racialized communities. It can help you evaluate programs, but it's really important that race-based data be used in accountability mechanisms like early warning systems. You know, that way supervisors can recognize problematic patterns involving individual officers or platoons or particular divisions or units. And then that way, and that way they can be used in accountability systems. So that's really important. And I also wanted to just pick up on what Knia said about discretion. You know, discretion is fertile ground. Wide discretion, wide officer discretion is fertile ground for discrimination. The Court of Appeal told us that in the Brown case. And the 1995 Commission on Systemic Racism recommended that police adopt clear criteria, guidance for when they can stop and question people. And so, you know, the commission has recommended that there be clear criteria as well. And a number of these solutions are in the commission's policy on eliminating racial discrimination, eliminating racial profiling in law enforcement. And then just lastly, you know, Christa, you were mentioning the Philadelphia model. You know, I wanted to know more about how that extra monitoring could address racism and sexism in police investigations of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So thanks for letting me jump in there, Chief Sloly.
Maybe I'll reflect a little bit on previous. The history of policing is critically important. The history of this country is important. I know I didn't learn about our Indigenous and Aboriginal history. Some on me, mostly on the institution of education that raised me as a 10-year-old immigrant kid to the point where as 26-year-old sergeant in the Toronto Police Service, I had almost no understanding of the history of our Indigenous and Aboriginal and Inuit people and its relationship to policing. So I want to recognize that. Now I appreciate we live across the largest undefended border for the United States. And there is a lot of shared institutional practice in policing and the justice system going north-south. My humble opinion, and I'm not a historian, so I stand to be challenged on this statement, but my humble opinion is actually we're far more alike, as Christa talked about, to the UK model of policing and the colonial history of that than we are to our relatively newer neighbors south of the border. Municipal policing itself is probably far more associated to the London Met and the British Home Office model than it ever will be by comparison to the United States. Just as a point of reference, that's neither good nor bad. The issue of systemic racism is alive and well in the Five Eyes country, US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and its impact on the Indigenous peoples in those countries is extreme. So just wanted to put that as for further context. What I do want to talk about is legislation. And as important as it is to look to the past around the legislation that created and enabled policing to have the disproportionate systemic impacts that we've been talking about, new legislation, I believe, is one of the key levers to changing the institution of policing and interconnecting it with that broader human services ecosystem that I talked about. So here in Ontario, I won't go into the details of it, but almost by virtue of a mistake, we have the legislation that actually detasks policing, right sizes and reintegrates it back into society, where the police chief of jurisdiction in every municipality of Ontario no longer has the singular and dominant power to determine what are the public safety priorities, how are they to be assessed, how are they to be solved, and how are they to be evaluated going forward. The new legislation changed that dynamic overnight. What we haven't done is realize the power of that legislation. Communities are focusing on reforming an old police service based on an old Police Services Act instead of transforming new policing under the new legislation here. That is why I constantly say we've got a jewel of legislative authority now. We need to fully leverage it, expand it across the country. We need academics, instead of throwing stones at us, to get together with us and work on evidence-based best practice to be used to implement in the new legislation to create an entire new model of community safety and well-being where the police are only a part of that, not the dominant element in it. I'd be happy to expand on that later on as we get into the discussion.
Yes, Chief Sloly, I just wanted to know, what is the name of the legislation you're referring to specifically?
Probably safer.
The new Comprehensive Police Services Act of Ontario passed into law that requires community safety and well-being to be the central organizing tool around public safety everywhere in Ontario.
So it's Christa. That legislation has obviously created some progress and some big changes, quite frankly. But I think, you know, in all honesty and fairness, at least from an Indigenous legal perspective, that a number of things occurred when we had that overhaul, specifically to the Safer Ontario Act. First of all, the current premier made a vague nod to the government's decision to halt the overhaul. So prior to this legislation going through, one was in the works, and it really lost its teeth under the new passage. You know, Ford was quoted as saying things like, "You can count on the government to respect the men and women of Ontario's police services by freeing them from the onerous restrictions that treat those in uniform as subjects of suspicion and scorn." So the discourse, so yes, there's a legislation, but the discourse around the implementation of this, yes, there's some good fundamental progress on principled change, but some of the teeth that was in the sort of former legislation that was working its way up was taken out. And so we do have a reorganization. So for instance, SIU changes, the OPRID changes, those are all progress. I'm not denying that they're progress. And I'm not also painting every single police officer with a brush that says, but there certainly has been a lot of political discourse, and the situation of that particular legislation, I would suggest, still lacks the perspective or the community understanding. It still comes from a place of privilege that doesn't take into account the Indigenous, Black, and people of color communities' lived experience of policing. Progress is good. You can look to other jurisdictions. So Saskatchewan's one I often point to when we talk about oversight, where they have put into place a second observer that is required to be Indigenous when there's Indigenous death engaged. That's a very small incremental, it's like one provision of change, but it's actually something that is demonstrative of inclusion of Indigenous people actually having a role in changing police. And so, I mean, I think I did a whole long panel with the SIU director actually on the changes in legislation. And one of the things we can agree on, I think, is there is progress. Law is helpful when it changes and allows for progress, but it's also one of those things that's yet to be seen. We need to actually live a little with the legislation put into place. And this touches kind of back on some of that the disaggregated data, we're making determinations and decisions in law without the full knowledge or awareness of where we need to make changes. You know, again, I'm going to use the national inquiry as an example because that's kind of the best one I can go to with my level of expertise. We could not make a finding of how many children are apprehended in any one jurisdiction of the country because the failure of disaggregated data being responsibly collected. In the policing issues that the findings were all being made on, we had the same issue. Practically any social justice or root cause issue of the social determinants of health were not a findable number or statistic because we don't carefully take care of things. So we make changes in law, but we fail to make the changes where they're needed, like something like the Indian Act in 2020 in a free and democratic society. That's the only race-based act in the free world. And we put into place these measures without actually taking into account what the reality is. And so I'm happy there's progress. And I think, you know, my hope is, I remain hopeful that a lot of these changes and this recharacterization of what public safety is going to include those diverse voices. But I have to, and I don't have to apologize, I have to say honestly, I fear that's not what's going to happen based on the legacy or the history of both the legislative changes and the failure to bring people on board that should have the most important voices, those that are experiencing the worst harm.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in here to Chief Sloly and say, you know, you're one of the leaders in our community who we can look up to for change. So you're a part of the solution. And I appreciate what you're saying about working with, because as you know, I'm the co-chair of the PACER committee. We've served on boards together with policing. I'm there to assist and have the community work with police to eliminate systemic racism. But with the legislation you're referring to, and now it's jogging my memory, it's called the COPS Act. And we had the Safer Ontario Act that was worked on by so many community members prior to the Conservative government coming in power, where Justice Tulloch did his review on carding, and he did his review on civilian oversight, and had so many recommendations that were starting to be implemented into the previous form of the Safer Ontario Act. And then for Doug Ford to come forward, call it the COPS Act, which is a slap in the face, because it's basically saying, this is the side I'm on, and then removing all of the protections is just another aspect of systemic racism in policing, along with the SIU and how it operates and all these mandates. So Canada is one of the best places to live in the world. And I've said it before, I think the Toronto Police Service and I would say now the Ottawa Police Service, because of you, Chief Sloly, is probably leaders in the world. And I would consider them leaders in the world. But what doesn't translate is everything down to the frontline officers who have to actually interact with the people. So as much as we can speak here as council and as chief and people who are professionals and debate these things or discuss them, what are the new officers on the ground? How are they dealing with people on the ground in rural Ontario or Canada or in densely populated neighborhoods where this treatment perpetuates? So there has to be more of outspokenness from people like you, Chief Sloly, who are going to influence media and influence decision makers to know that what they're doing has to change, because it always feels like a never-ending battle. And we know for over 30, 40 years, at least just with SIU, we've had these challenges and it hasn't gotten better. But I take your point, and I think that everyone listening and watching should know that there are members of our community who are working together for the best interest. It's those detractors, those who deny systemic racism even exists, who are the problem, who have to be called out by people in the force and by those high-level officials.
Thanks. I'm going to try to jump back in with a raised hand here again. Again, please forgive me. I'm not a lawyer, so Christa and I'll default to your expertise here. But I did participate in the creation of the Safer Ontario Act. I worked very closely with Matt Terrigian, who was then the Deputy Minister, as well as the Solicitor Generals and Attorney Generals under the previous Liberal government. I've worked very closely with Sylvia Jones, Devon Clunas, and Mary DiTommaso, who are the new versions of under the PC government. The act was changed when the government changed. It changed in the area substantially around the SIU and the OIPRD. It did not change in the area of community safety and well-being. It was left almost entirely as it was, which made me very surprised and very hopeful. I think they missed it. But in missing it, we've all missed it. That's my point.
Right.
Have in the world the most enabling legislation that has the most direct impact on police budget, police oversight, police boards, police chiefs, and every single police officer and every single police member. The most enabling legislation in the history of Canada, and I believe in the history of the Western world, but we've dismissed it. We're looking right past it. If you want to have, Sunil, if you want to have legally binding changes, we actually have legislation that says the police chief of jurisdiction everywhere in Ontario is no longer the dominant decision maker around how public safety gets done there. It requires the mayor and council in every municipality to convene a table, not just with the cops at the head of the table, telling everybody else how it should be done from their historically privileged and empowered position, but only as a member of the table where social services, public health, public education, the not-for-profit sector, and yes, demographically represented local leaders get to co-design, co-implement, and co-evaluate everything that to do with community safety and well-being. That is a game changer. And none of us in policing, in academia, in the justice system have truly understood the power of that act. And that is why, Christa, to your point, yes, there's been a little progress, but not a lot. Knia, to your point, it may be circulating up here, but it hasn't been driven down into the experience of the local police officer working in community. This is unique legislation. We can complain all we want about the past legislation. This is new. And not only that, across Canada, BC is going to change its act. Alberta is going to change its act. Manitoba is changing its act. If we don't take advantage of this unique legislation here in Ontario, we'll fail to do that in the other provinces, and we'll fail to transform policing in this country. That's my point.
And I will take you up on it, Chief. I'm going to actually go through that and review it and share it with my colleagues. Thank you for sharing that with us.
And I loved the passion, sorry, Akwasi. I love the passion in which you talk, Chief. I think that you do demonstrate progressive. I think part of the apprehension, you're right, moving forward, we need to harness the best parts of that legislation. But I also, as a member of multiple committees that advise police services and oversight, I literally am on a dozen of various things. And very often, for instance, I'm not the voice representative of Indigenous people that live in Toronto. I'm a lawyer, a director. I am not that voice. I can speak on behalf of client base and everything else, but we're not there because a lot of our social structures, a lot of the actual systemic discrimination that continues in things like models. And all you have to do is look at something like the report by Oprah, the systemic one, Broken Promises, and the Senator Murray Sinclair's report on that police board service. And when you have multiple tables and they're not coming together well, or they haven't historically demonstrated the adequate inclusion, that's what's problematic. So is it hopeful? Is it good that legislation exists that we can try to harness, and it's going to take voices like ours to harness? Absolutely. But that's that one point about it remains to be seen yet. And I don't want to be so pessimistic, but it's been my experience. I have literally been on a number. So we made submissions to the TALC review. I've been a member of the advisory board of SIU. I say the same things every year for the last 12 years. The same comments regurgitated over and over, and we're not tapping into those things. So I think it's a good challenge, and it's something I'll look a little more closely at too. So thank you for sharing that today. I will try to contain some of my pessimism and hope for a little more optimism, but I still also have to articulate some of the changes that ended up eventually occurring were not beneficial for the Indigenous community or did not go far enough.
Akwasi, did you want to jump in? Okay.
I just wanted, in thinking about the act, and I'm glad we brought our attention here. One of the questions that I want to pose, and maybe I'll leave with this, we could open up to the panel, the attendees as well, but it's specifically for Chief Sloly. And I apologize, literally every time I go to say your name, because of when we work together in Toronto, I want to call you Deputy Sloly. And I always apologize for the demotion. I always wanted to see you as Chief, and I'm glad you're Chief. So Chief Sloly, part of what I'm interested in from your perspective is how you translate and how you get the rank and file to basically step in line, right? Like, how do you communicate these messages beyond simply the accountability piece, right? Like, what I would like to see, as I've said before, is more discipline, but how do you as a chief get your membership to buy into the changes that we would like to see?
Thanks, Akwasi, and I hope forever we'll be just Peter and Akwasi as opposed to ranks. And let me just acknowledge, please, Julianne. I think beyond Christa, I've worked with the panel members for a long, long time, and I'm grateful to each of you for your truth-telling and willingness to work with the police, work with me in sometimes very trying and difficult circumstances. And Christa, to your point, I'm sure the other three panelists can say we've had these conversations for as long as we've known each other, and none of us are satisfied with the level of change. All of us are struggling to be optimistic and not pessimistic, but we're committed to the long haul on this, and I think that's why we're still here today, trying to make things better. Akwasi, I think your question actually reflects on what I've seen in the chat function. You know, how do you translate legislation? How do you translate culture change? How do you translate strategy down to the hearts and minds of the men and women working on the front lines and their ability to demonstrate that consistently and effectively in their interactions with the community. And all the while doing that change while we're literally, to use the analogy, we're rebuilding the plane while it's still flying in the air. And so that means we make mistakes and people get hurt, we make mistakes, we get off course, all of which is now hyper scrutinized by media and social media. So, you know, the expectation is that change will happen instantly. There'll be no more mistakes, no more tragedies, and everyone will do this perfectly. And that's just simply not realistic in any institution, never mind one as complex and with as long a history as policing. For me, it's a combination of those three areas, though. Strategically, you need to bring to bear politics, legislation, and strategy, with all the good and bad ugly that goes with it. So leverage the hell out of what you can. Whatever particular government you have at municipal, provincial, and federal levels, work with it as best you can. Whatever legislation you have, leverage the hell out of it as far as you can. And whatever strategies you can put in place, don't just make it a strategy, resource it and implement it. That is an act of leadership. It is not an act of skill. It is will, not skill. Do you truly want to make the change? Because there's 1,000 explanations as to why. Too hard, too costly, too long, too political. I'm too close to the end of my time. It's simply the will of implementation. At the ground level, if you don't change the conditions and expectations of your members, if you still stay stuck in that crime management, enforcement-driven model where every solution must come through an act of enforcement, investigation, prosecution, and incarceration, that is what your people will do for you every day on the ground. If you adopt a community safety well-being model where the social determinants health, harm reduction, victim-focused approach drives the operational mindset, eventually they will change their thinking, their decision-making, and their behavior. Discretion will change in that concept. But if you can't switch from the old model to the new model, if you can't leverage abandon the old legislation and embrace the new legislation, tactically nothing will change. I want to thank you for raising procedural justice. That is at the heart of not just discretion, but the articulation of it, not in court, but on the street with the human being that's being interacted with. We don't talk enough about that. I come back to it again. Our academia, as you are a rare exception. Thank you. You have worked with police. U of T criminology has stayed close to policing. We're seeing less and less of that these days. We need people like Tom Tyler out of the United States who work really closely with police and help them to understand how that translates to the tactical level. We need more of that here in Canada. Of the Five Eyes countries, Canada has the worst relationship, the least relationship with its academia. And so that's something I'd love to see more of going forward.
Well, I'll keep my eye on my inbox for an email and an invite from you then.
Good man. I love the way you turned that around. Careful what you wish for.
So reimagining the role of police is important, and this is a great discussion. But, you know, as you'd ask Akwasi, you know, how could there be more accountability among rank and file officers? And it leads to the question, you know, what's the role of the government of Ontario there? And the commission, in its deputation to the Toronto Police Service Board in August of 2020, talked about some of the changes that need to be made to policing legislation, so there's just that. So one of the things that was lost from the Safer Ontario Act that didn't make its way into the COPS Act is independent investigation of police complaints. In 2018 and 2019, 90% of public complaints were investigated in Ontario by the same police services that the complaints were about. And then you layer that on top of a huge lack of transparency when it comes to police discipline. Unless something ends up at a police disciplinary tribunal, no one knows what happened. The public doesn't know. And so, there's certainly things that can be done to increase transparency and accountability.
Thank you, Sunil. I think given the time, we'll move to the audience questions. So I will start with question number 1 is, how does the police union fit into the issue of systemic racism in policing and the road to reform? Chief Sloly, would you like to start off?
Yeah, thank you. You've got 3 major direct players in any police organization, municipal police organization. I won't speak for the province, OPP, Sûreté de Québec, or RCMP. You've got the police chief, you've got the police board, and then you have the collective bargaining units. In most large police services, there are usually 2, one representing senior members and the other one representing frontline members. Disproportionately capable group of unions. First of all, again, not an economist, but the reality is unionization largely has improved the conditions of workers across the board. It has raised the standards, productivity, safety. It has provided a social safety net, benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So to say that we need to get rid of the unions, I believe is as uninformed and unhelpful as the defund, abolish, pure defund and radical abolish policing. How do we work better with unions? I will tell you, they have become very sophisticated at government relations, and that is not a criticism, it's an observation. They have become very influential through setting legislation and resetting legislation. They have as good or more strong public media, social media, public platform as police chiefs these days. So they're a formidable entity within the context of resetting, reforming, transforming policing. Again, simply demonizing and not trying to figure out how to work with, engage, enable them to be part of the solution and less a part of the problem, I think is the wrong approach. There are union leaders like Tom Stamatakis, who's the president of the Canadian Police Association, who is one of the most articulate, progressive, and reform-minded leaders. And I would work with him any day on any project that, along the things that we've talked about. In fact, we have co-presented on the issue of systemic racism, and he has in his own voice been as effective as I have in terms of articulating this issue going forward. So are they part of the challenge? Yes. Could they be part of the solution? Absolutely must be. And there are leaders within the union environment that can stand with and be allies to Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, as well as progressive police chiefs, to move this forward.
Yeah, I want to jump in and say that I believe the police unions are the key to ending systemic racism. That's how they fit in. And I say that because my experience in Toronto with the police unions is that they've always seemed to be in opposition to any progress when it comes to race relations. And I say that because when I was one of the lawyers and advocates fighting against arbitrary detention and stops, police unions seem to be, the head at least, would seem to be always trying to challenge that they're, first of all, saying there isn't a problem, and second of all, saying that these things are useful tools, knowing very well that they violate human rights, they violate charter rights. So if the police unions were on the side of positive reform, they would be the ones to be able to keep their officers in line, because it seems that they hold the power. And I don't want to say they hold more power than the chief, because they have to take the direction from the chief. But we've seen work to rule campaigns play out when certain legislation changes. And unions, if they just said, we're going to do our job with integrity, honesty, and not worry about the bottom line of, you know, if crime rates go down, they won't need that many police or any things like that, that seem to be the issue, we'd have a much better operation. So they're key. They're key. I just have different views of how they play in, but they are key to solving this problem.
I was just going to say, I agree. They are key. And in every single inquest process that ALS has been in, where there's been a police use of force, the association shows up, and even the word of racism or discrimination is like highly legally processed by the union. and the association. And so it's key to get them on board. And you see that happening in other unionized industries and areas where they're looking at it from a human rights approach. So I agree, they're key to helping the wave of change.
Thank you, Christa. I'll move on to the next question. This one is directed to Chief Sloly. How do you think that the police can be leaders in pushing for the detasking of certain problematic activities, like the response to mental health calls, where there is an overlap in many siloed municipal and provincial agencies? Chief?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that term, detasking. I recognize Akwasi for using it earlier on. I'm less concerned about defunding. I think most of that is around the detasking element, the better focus of it. I don't know a police leader anywhere in Canada. It'd be a little bit harder for me to say in the United States, but of the Major City Chiefs Association members, of which I'm a part of, I don't know of a single police chief that wants to be involved as the primary response for mental health and addictions, or a wider variety of social services issues, quite frankly. We get called for kids not doing their homework, truancy, through to my son's down in the basement and I think he's smoking marijuana, through to advice on girlfriends and intimate partner relationships. This has been an unfortunate trend in most of Western society where we have tasked the police. We have deinstitutionalized in some cases, like the mental health institution in the 50s and 60s, and we have tasked the police without being able to resource other civil actors to be the 24/7, 365 social services, mental health and addictions resource for 98% of the population in Canada. The other 2% have their own private security. So this is never going to be a sustainable or successful model. We want out of it. What we will not do and cannot do is simply have someone say, okay, on such and such a date, arbitrarily, this date, this time, this amount of your resources is going to be taken away from you, and somehow that capacity is going to appear on scale in a small, medium, or large-sized jurisdiction somewhere in Canada. That will not solve the problems we're talking about here today. It will create new problems, and we'll get back into a similar problem that happened when we defunded institutions for mental health and addictions in the 50s and 60s without creating the capacity back in the community. Why would we repeat the same mistake now when we're looking at institutional change? So I am for detasking in a structured, systematized process where we have true partners at the table looking at, through a community safety and well-being legislation, how do we actually right size, right task, right resource, the right integrated services to address these complex issues. So I am in favor of detasking in that context.
I'm gonna just hop in here. I don't have my I don't have the reactions function available to me at the moment, so sorry. So one of the things, because I've been doing a lot of work, I've been doing some work looking at detasking the police, and one of the first obstacles that we come to is actually determining what exactly the police are doing with their time and their money. And so, Deputy Police Chief Peter, I recall from your time in Toronto, you produced a number of performance reports that went public up until about 2011. And in those reports, there was a fairly good accounting for what the police were doing with respect to how much time was spent crime fighting, how much time was spent involved in community engagement and things like that. And those reports have since dropped off. And so I'm wondering, at the OPS, do you, and what recommendations would you have for a scholar like myself who is interested in determining what the police do beyond simply looking at the scant information provided in board reports, as well as the little bit of information we can garner from looking at the calls for service data that comes through the websites? How can we find information about what the police are actually doing with the time and how they're actually spending taxpayers' money?
Yeah, no, thanks, Akwasi. I'll try to be very brief. Probably best in class right now would be Edmonton Police Service under Chief Dale McPhee and York Region in terms of really getting good data and understanding. Waterloo Region would be probably third, but that would be your top area. Ottawa Police right now, we are in transition. We don't have the data system, the information management. We don't have the internal skills, and we unfortunately don't have a sufficient third-party academic to be able to support that. That is one of those examples that I think we need to be able to do that on scale across Canada. Before we do that, though, if you want to see what we're currently doing, I'm not sure how effective that is. What I would really want to do is get people like yourself to help us. Well, what should we be doing or could we be doing that would be a better use of our tactical, operational, and strategical activities? how do we better utilize resources at those three levels, as opposed to how do we better measure the old model? I don't want to measure the old model. I want to create new key performance indicators. I want to be able to translate that so the frontline member can understand how to turn that into an hour of work, a day of work, a month of work, a year of work, a career of work, where they can be properly assessed, properly rewarded, or properly sanctioned if they're not actually producing value. That's important work we need to do in policing.
And that key performance indicator piece, I think, is important to note, right? Like, this conversation about defunding the police emerged largely last summer, but conversations about both the mission creep of the police and expanded police budgets have been taking place for a long time. And there have been very strong reports coming out from the CACP on the performance metrics and indicators from Statistics Canada, right? And so from my perspective, we need that information about what the police are currently doing, and to be quite frankly, wasting their time doing, often with poor outcomes in the other services work, to figure out what of the police work we can detask from the police, we can give to those other agencies, and then have the police focus on the types of things we want to focus on. But at the moment in the city of Toronto, where I stand, we can't have that conversation because we don't actually know, as members of the public or interested parties, what the police are doing.
There's only one point that I touch on, and Sunil raised it earlier when I touched on something like the Philadelphia model. One of the things that has to be talked about when you're talking about detasking too is where you can have collaborative or less resource sucking processes. So the Philadelphia model is a model that looks to frontline workers, so social workers, health providers, that puts them in a position to work cooperatively with police. You're seeing this happen in places like Montreal as well, where the Montreal Police Service is working with some Indigenous with an Indigenous women's shelter when there's an instance of sexual assault. And so you have a civilian component working with, that's trusted and builds a relationship working with police. So where there's the need for investigative or tactical police operations, it's married with social service that has the know-how, has the community connection, and has the ability to bridge those. And that is a type of detasking, but it's also a type of partnership that when we see models, there are successful models. And it seems in Canada, there's this huge resistance to trying to do it. And there's not from you, Chief, but from a number of jurisdictions, there is arguably a resistance to build in models and to work that way collaboratively. And so, looking at things like shared services or where you can detask but align, because there may always be components that require police operations and investigations, even if it's not my son smoking in the basement pot potentially, but there's just been a domestic dispute and one of them smoking pot. So you're working with collaboratively. And so I think that's one thing that we also have to realize, that it's not just as simple as defunding or detasking, but that we have to look at it and reframe how do the police services support those social services when there's no net there, and how do you delineate the type of tasks while still working collaboratively to address root causes.
Christa, I really believe we're saying very much the same things. Every police agency, every major police agency in Canada has at least one, if not multiple versions of integrated service delivery. A mental health addictions worker teamed with a police officer in a car, social services workers and foot patrol officers. There are so many examples. What we don't have, except in Ontario, is legislation that requires that not just to be the ad hoc one-off, but to be the standard operating model in every aspect of core policing. I go back to it again. We have the legislation, the interest is there. There are pilots all over the place. They're not properly evaluated, evaluated. And so it's ad hoc. It's not effective. It's not making a real impact. But the potential is all there right now. We just got to bring this thing together.
Thank you, Chief. I'll go on to the next question to fit a few more in before we conclude today. The blue wall has been hindering the justice system from hearing what actually happened in police encounters, where bad police practices do not come to light because police have no memory of situations when they clearly saw bad policing behavior. What is happening in police forces to encourage better reporting behavior, which undermines the police forces?
Julianne, I'm getting in the habit of answering first because it just feels like these are first lob to me. But if anybody else would like to go first, I'll yield the floor, and if not, I'll try to speak on the topic.
I can take a tackle at it, Chief Sloly. The blue wall has been hindering the justice system, yes. What actually happened in police encounters where bad practices do not come to light. It happens to me all the time in court. I'm sorry to say, whenever I challenge police injustice, it seems to be a memory loss. I answered another question, and when it comes to reform, one of the most major things, and this is answering the use of force, does there need to be a change to the use of force model? My respectful opinion is there needs to be a change to accountability and how accountability is measured. Basically, when police officers are found of misconduct, there has to be a better mechanism for them to be terminated for their misconduct. I think policing is a very honorable profession, and the public trusts police with their lives. And when police officers abuse their power or hurt people, especially severely, or even minor, even in tendencies of racial discrimination, those things are not welcome in police forces. And if police officers knew they would lose their job for any of those violations, I almost can guarantee you that it would drop. The misconducts and the blue wall and all these lines would drop, because a career in policing is a great profession and nobody wants to lose it. And if you commit misconduct, you should lose that privilege. So that's my respectful submission on that, or my opinion on that.
And
Another
the public
thing-
action has an, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sunil. Go ahead, Sunil.
Another thing that police services should consider is a duty to report, right? So if it's built into policy, that you're not just simply a bystander, that if you observe potential misconduct, you do report it, that could create some change. But again, if it's just a policy change, how is it monitored, right? So, how are supervisors proactively determining whether that duty to report is being met? So that's an important consideration.
And part of the issue is like the use of force forms that are required. So there is policy that exists that if it's not, it's more than words or it's like racial slurs, the minute that there's use of force, but it doesn't capture everything well enough. But my point was going to be, although that's important for officers to have accountability when they're in their active duty, one of the things we're seeing, this is why, we have people in the hundreds gathering and protesting. One of the things you're seeing is the use of technology is changing the public will and opinion. And if police don't start changing culturally with that, you're going to continue to see that resistance. What happens when the officer doesn't report someone kneeling on someone's neck to the point they die, but then the whole world sees it on video? And this is where you're going to have public will increasing or demands for change because we see more. And when an officer doesn't actually report, the question of why weren't they accountable, why didn't they report, but yet we all see this live, this is where we have a hard time reconciling as members of the public who are supposed to put trust into a police service that's supposed to protect everyone. And so I think there's a big part of public accountability there, and an awareness that police services should now, almost as a course of matter, understand the risk management or risk assessment of how everything is captured publicly and disseminated publicly, and that has to be an awareness where there is accountability, because if it's not an internal mechanism, it will continue to be a public mechanism and demand for change.
Julianne, I'm in your hands. Do you want me to contribute, or do you want to try to get to other questions?
Well, no, go. You know what? I'll put the next question, and then Chief Sloly, you could answer, make some commentary on that, and perhaps ask what will probably be our last question of the day, because I do believe it is directed to you. How do you feel these issues being discussed today are being addressed? Sorry, I've just lost the question here. Are being addressed at the police colleges? Is there any move to greater levels of education from those who go to police colleges?
I think I can answer that one relatively quickly. To a degree, given the economic slowdown, hiring has slowed down. I'm pretty sure most of the major police services, I can't imagine it would be different with the medium and small size, are now looking well beyond the minimum grade 12. I can think of maybe one, maybe two of the officers I've hired in the last 18 months that do not have post-secondary. Most are coming in with at least one college or university equivalent, more and more masters, and increasingly more regularly PhD students coming in. The average age of people hired in my day was 21, 22. Now we're talking 28 to 32 years old. They have life experience. They're more diverse, more educated. They have had supervisory leadership positions. They've worked in the social services, healthcare sector. They're former business owners, managers. They're a much more high quality, highly mature, highly diverse, highly educated group of people. I actually think we start to lose that quality once they get into the police colleges, because those police colleges are built on the 50-year-old model that we've been talking about. I'd actually like to see get away from the police colleges. I'd like us to see our people being educated in post-secondary institutions with a whole different pedagogical approach, where yes, understanding the law and training around use of force are a component, but a decreased component. Understanding things like the history of Canada, the history of policing, the current context of institutions, how things actually work in terms of underpinnings of crime, social determinants of health, helping them understand what trauma-informed, victim-centered approaches are. These are things that need to be right at the foundation of policing. We're hiring the right people. They're not getting the right training, education, and development at the front end or throughout the rest of their 30 years. That's a very important thing. I do want to make this one emphasis, though. I believe training is the least influential portion of keeping a human being in policing at the highest operating, ethical, equitable level. Development, coaching, mentoring, the operating model change that I've talked about will have a far greater impact than a 1 hour or 1 day or 1 week training course. Attitudes don't change in a classroom. They change with other life experiences, development, and coaching. So we've overused training to correct policing.
Thank you very much. Given the time, I think that's where we'll wrap up today. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions today, but on